All right, so we now turn to our last panel of the day, which is going to be the panel on public welfare. As you can see, we have three panelists, one of whom is still in transit. So I'm going to introduce everyone, and we'll just switch the order up, and my understanding is he'll be here in a few minutes. This entire meeting is entitled AI for the Social Good, and I think our last panel really goes directly to the heart of how we can use data to help understand, improve our understanding of and support broader societal needs. Our panelists really, again, span, I think, an interesting and broad range of topics in this area. So our first panelist, again still in transit, is Roy Austin. Roy is a member of the White House Domestic Policy Council as Deputy Assistant to the President for the Office of Urban Affairs, Justice, and Opportunity. In this position, Austin coordinates the formulation and implementation of policy covering criminal justice, civil rights, housing, labor, human services, and initiatives such as Promise Zones. Raed Ghani is the director of the Center for Data Science and Public Policy and a senior fellow at the Harris School of Public Policy and the Computational Institute at the University of Chicago. Before joining the University of Chicago, Raed was the chief scientist of the Obama 2012 election campaign, where he focused on data analytics and technology to target and influence voters, donors, and volunteers. Previously, he was a research scientist and led the machine learning group at Accenture Labs. And finally, our third panelist is Hannah Wallach. Hannah is a researcher at Microsoft Research in New York City and an assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst School of Computer Science, where she's one of 5 core faculty members involved in UMass's recently formed Computational Social Science Initiative. She develops machine learning methods for analyzing the structure, content, and dynamics of complex social processes, such as the US political system, the US patent system, and software development communities. So that's our panel today. As I said, I guess we will take folks a bit out of order. So Raed, why don't we start out with you?
Thank you. So since this day is about social good, I thought I could start by depressing everyone for a few minutes. So I'm going to tell you a few depressing stories, and then we'll cheer up and figure out how to actually make them less depressing. So depressing story number 1, police misconduct. Baltimore, Ferguson, Chicago, LA, we're all familiar with the problem. What's even more depressing is it turns out that police departments for a long time have had these systems they call early intervention systems that are supposed to raise flags for officers who are going to go on to have one of these adverse incidents. It turns out that those systems just don't work. You actually look at the system, turns out they were built by 4 people sitting around a table guessing what those flags should be, but never bothering to evaluate them. And it turns out that for the past 12 months we've been working with the White House Police Data Initiative, and in one instance working with Charlotte Mecklenburg, we evaluated their system and found that it was flagging about 60% of their officers, which is making it completely useless. And even when flagging 60% of the officers, it was only capturing 60, 70, 80% of all the officers who were going to go on to have one of these incidents. So completely broken system. So depressing story number 2. Lead poisoning. Again, we're familiar with that mostly because of Flint these days, but it turns out that water and lead in water pipes is not the major cause of lead poisoning in the country. The major cause of lead poisoning is paint, which is in walls, doors, and windows. And it's fine as long as it stays in there, but when paint starts chipping and starts coming on the ground and kids start crawling around the age of 1, they pick up lead paint in their fingers, hands, put it in their mouth, it goes into your bloodstream, and has pretty horrible consequences. The worst part is, not that this is not bad enough, that these effects are irreversible. Once you have lead poisoning, there's nothing you can do to fix that. So what do our cities do today to deal with this problem? Well, they wait until somebody does get lead poisoning, and then they go in and fix their home for the future kids who are going to live there. So we basically use kids as sensors to detect lead, and then we go send people over to fix the lead problem for future kids. Depressing story number 3, if we keep going. You have to do something to make it less depressing. over 30% of kids in the country drop out of high school. They don't finish on time. The ones who finish on time or graduate, they may not apply to college. The ones who make it to college may not actually graduate college. At the same time, we have all these after-school programs that we hear about, thousands and thousands and thousands of them. The problem, nobody knows how to match them. They're not being targeted at the right kids. They're often sort of opt-in. They're often, you have to go in there with some criteria. So we have this big problem, and we have a bunch of solutions, but they're just not connecting together. Depressing story number 4, blight. This is a picture of a home in Cincinnati, but it's Baltimore, it's Philadelphia, it's Detroit, it's New Orleans. Blight starts as a small problem. One home sort of starts running down. It spreads across to the street, to the neighborhood. Neighborhood starts declining. Communities start declining. People start moving away. They get employed, and entire cities are struggling with this issue. The way we're dealing with it today, most cities wait until properties and neighborhoods go into blight, look for investments to put them back into the neighborhood to try to revitalize them. Sometimes they work. Most of the times it's just too expensive to bring them back. So in all of these different problems and all these different depressing stories, sort of the bright side is that there is a way to fix, or at least start fixing, some of these problems. And as Suchi was saying, in a lot of, same as the medical scenario, in a lot of these cases, a lot of data exists for different reasons about all these different phenomena. And we think that AI and machine learning and data science and all the different buzzwords we're talking about, combined with all of the data that exists, can help solve these problems, right? So let's go back to our depressing story number 1, police misconduct. When you take the old system that exists and it doesn't really work, what you can also do is take all the data that does exist in those places. So everything about police officers, their characteristics, their demographics, their behaviors, stops, citations, arrests, internal affairs, complaints. And when you take all of that data, so we've spent the last year working with the White House, with Charlotte, with Knoxville, with Nashville, with Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, to try to build a system that can do better. And it turns out that you have the data you need to do this much more effectively than it's being done today. And we found that we could build a system that reduces the false positives that the previous system was given by about 50%, and can get 20 to 30% more officers correctly identified. So you can start doing preventative interventions, training, counseling, put them on the desk, all the different things. And more importantly, you can start being much more proactive. So instead of when you get a dispatch call that comes in, instead of picking the nearest officer, so let's say the nearest officer is 2 minutes away, but that person has an 85% risk of having an adverse incident, but the next nearest is 4 minutes away, and maybe only has 20% chance. Now the dispatcher has a way to think about, how do I trade off those things? Are the 2 minutes really important? Is it worth the extra risk? And they can start being much more rational and data-driven to solve these problems. The second story, the lead poisoning problem, we've been working with Chicago Department of Public Health and now extending that work to a few other departments, of taking the past 10 years of data they've been collecting on all the blood lead level tests and all the home inspections. And again, being preventative. Can I predict which kid is going to get lead poisoning and send my inspectors there before the kid gets poisoned as opposed to after? And then again, more importantly, you can start being, again, much more proactive. And what we've been doing now is working with hospitals to integrate this into the electronic medical record system. So when a pregnant woman goes in for a checkup, it raises a flag saying, well, the kid that's going to be born is going to be at risk of lead poisoning. So the health department go in and fix the problem before the kid's even born. Same thing on some of the work on helping kids graduate on time, same for sort of preventing blight. And these are not 4 or 5 isolated problems. It turns out that when you start looking at these things over the past 4 years or so, we've worked with over 50 organizations, government agencies, cities, states, federal agencies, nonprofits, and all of these are recurring problems that you see, not just in this space, but even some of the things we've talked about this morning, right? So when you start abstracting some of these, it turns out that you have a few different problems that a lot of social good areas fall into. So the first one is the early warning system problem, right? Can I detect something early? Whether it's a medical condition, whether it's blight, whether it's high school kids who may not graduate in time, whether it's lead poisoning. There is a resource allocation problem where most cities, most organizations have limited resources. There are 10,000 homes you can inspect, but your city has 500,000. How do you deal with that? How do I modify my policies? How much impact am I having? And can I create new data? So here are some sort of ways of thinking about this. And one of the ways to think about it is what's missing today, right? We feel like there's sort of, why is more of this work not happening? Why are we having a workshop about this topic when we should all have been doing this work forever? And there are three reasons why it's not happening. One is there aren't enough people who both have the skills and the understanding of these problems. Second is that a lot of these organizations don't really know what to do. They don't have peers, they don't have case studies, they don't have use cases. And third is we don't exactly have the right tools available for them, right? We haven't built things. When they want to do something, when a government agency wants to do something, they start from scratch. They don't have pre-existing things that they can start from. And so what we need to do is sort of fill in these three gaps. We need to create, both educate academia on how to understand these problems and work with them, but also educate policymakers to understand how to solve these types of problems. We need to create lots and lots of use cases like today where people are talking about, here's how my work applies to this, so that people have an appreciation of what can be done. And then we need to figure out sort of how do we create methods that are specifically targeted at these problems, not as a byproduct, but as a primary goal. How do I take important problems and develop tools that can be reused and methods that are out there? And here's sort of some, I'm not going to go into detail, but it's not a single, none of us individually can solve these problems. We need people with a lot of those skills, which means you need people coming in from different areas, not just computer science and statistics, social sciences, understanding the problem, being able to communicate the problems. And then there's a big piece around there on privacy and ethics and transparency, because you just don't need the hard skills, but you also need to understand the implications and the unintended consequences that a lot of people have talked about already. So here's some things we've been doing at the universities to plug at the end that kind of combines our efforts on the computer science side and on the policy side to bring people together, to have both of those skills. And then a lot of the things I talked about, we've been running this program, which is this fourth year called Data Science for Social Good, that again brings computer scientists, social sciences, statistics, policy people to really work on these problems in collaboration with government agencies. So I'm going to stop now, but happy to answer questions later in the panel as well as later on today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray.
Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. So this is actually perfect because my talk follows on, I think, very nicely from Raid's talk. I want to talk about these kinds of skills and these interdisciplinary collaborations and how we can actually start to do this in practice. So I'm Hannah Wallach. I'm a senior researcher at Microsoft and an adjunct associate professor at UMass Amherst. And great. Like many of today's speakers, my background is in machine learning. However, much of my recent work has been in the interdisciplinary area of computational social science. And this shift in direction has given me an opportunity to start thinking outside the kind of algorithmic black boxes that are often prioritized within the machine learning community, and instead to start thinking about some of the opportunities and challenges involved in developing and using machine learning methods to analyze real-world data about society. And so I thought I'd talk about that today rather than kind of a specific project, focusing on some of the differences between computer science and the social sciences and their implications. So I'm going to structure my comments around 3 points: goals, models, and data. And then I'll conclude by explaining how machine learning for reasoning about social phenomena differs from machine learning for addressing other challenges. So when I first started working in computational social science, I kept overhearing conversations between computer scientists and social scientists that involved sentences like, "I don't get it, why is that research?" And I couldn't figure out why. But then I found this quote that I think really captures the heart of this disconnect. Computer scientists may be interested in finding the needle in the haystack, such as the right web page to display from a search. But social scientists are more commonly interested in characterizing the haystack. So in other words, the goals typically pursued by computer scientists and social scientists actually fall into two different categories. The first is prediction. So prediction is all about using observed data to make predictions about missing information or future yet to be observed data. And these are really finding the needle tasks. In general, it's computer scientists and decision makers who are most interested in them. And sure enough, machine learning has traditionally been relatively dominated by prediction tasks, such as classifying images, recognizing handwriting, and even playing games like chess and Go. The second category is explanation. So here, the focus is on why questions. In other words, finding plausible explanations for the observed data. These explanations can then be compared with established theories or previous findings, or even used to generate new theories. So explanation tasks are therefore characterizing the haystack tasks. And in general, it's social scientists who are most interested in them. So for example, what is the role of gender in the workplace? Are government organizations more likely to comply with public records requests if they know that their peers have already complied? How is crowd work changing the employment landscape? So perhaps unsurprisingly, these different goals, prediction and explanation, lead to very different modeling approaches. So in most prediction tasks, causality plays no role. The emphasis is firmly on accuracy. In other words, we don't care why a model makes good predictions, we just care that it does. And so as a result, models for prediction do not need to be interpretable. And this is great. This means there are few constraints on their structure. They can be very complex black boxes that require large amounts of data to train. In contrast, explanation tasks are fundamentally concerned with causality. So here, the goal is to use observed data to provide evidence in support or opposition of existing causal explanations. And as a result, models for explanation must be interpretable. Their structure must be easily linked back to the explanation of interest and grounded in existing theoretical knowledge about the world. To put it differently, models for prediction are often intended to replace human interpretation or reasoning, whereas models for explanation are intended to inform or guide human reasoning. As well as pursuing different goals, computer scientists and social scientists typically work with different types of data. So computer scientists often work with large-scale digitized data sets that are typically collected and made available for no particular purpose other than machine learning research. Of course, this is a generalization, but if you look at many of the papers coming out of the machine learning conferences, this is indeed the case. In contrast, social scientists use data collected or curated in order to answer specific questions. Because this is labor-intensive, these data sets are usually small-scale, often qualitative, and non-digitized. But thanks to the internet, we now have large-scale digitized data that document all kinds of social phenomena. So it's really tempting to say, why not use these data in combination with the powerful predictive models developed by computer scientists? And I think this is a great idea. We should be thinking about how best to do this. However, unlike the data sets traditionally used by computer scientists, these new data sets are about people, their attributes, their actions, and their interactions, going about their everyday lives. Not only do these data sets document social phenomena on a massive scale, they do so at the granularity of individual people and their second-to-second behavior. As a result, they raise some complicated ethical questions regarding privacy, fairness, accountability, and transparency. And I spend a lot of time thinking about these questions. As I'm sure it's going to be no surprise to anybody in this room, it's pretty clear from the media that one of the things that terrifies people the most about machine learning is the use of black box predictive models in social contexts where it's possible to do more harm than good. And there's a great deal of concern, and maybe rightly so, that these models will reinforce existing biases and marginalize certain populations. In addition, when data points are humans, error analysis takes on a whole new level of importance because errors have real-world consequences on everyday people's lives. It's not enough for a model to be 99% accurate. We need to know who's affected when there's a mistake and in exactly what way. So when we use machine learning to reason about social phenomena, and especially when we do so to draw actionable conclusions, we have to be careful, and more careful than when we use machine learning in many other contexts. But here's the thing. These ethical challenges aren't entirely new. Yeah, they're new to computer scientists, they're new to engineers, and they're new to developers. But they're not new to social scientists. So to me, this highlights a really important path forward, and it's one that I've been pursuing in my own work. We need to prioritize explanation, interpretability, and error analyses, even in predictive contexts. And most importantly, we need to actually collaborate with social scientists in order to understand the implications of our modeling decisions. And with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you.
So I'd like to invite Roy Austin to the stage.
So I have to start this conversation on artificial intelligence on the lack of intelligence of men and directions, which explains the delay in getting here, as we found a new route to the Willard from the White House, which is actually a really direct shot usually. So with that, I really do want to start off from my co-panelists' comments on being 99% right. I only wish in the areas that I get to work on criminal justice and civil rights, that we were even close to 99% right. And my fear, I come to artificial intelligence with a fear, not only because I'm not anything close to a computer scientist, but my fear on just replicating the bias that has existed in this system for such a long time. To steal language from Brian Stevenson, who would say it is better to be rich and guilty than to be poor and innocent. And the problem is, and if you think about that is really the problem of our criminal justice system if we look back decades and decades, is that poor people dealt with one set of circumstances and one set of results, whereas if you were wealthy, you had a different set. And so what we have from that is really, really bad data. Really, really bad data on what in fact prevents and limits crime in this country. So let's talk about some of that data that is so troubling to me. We have something called the Uniform Crime Report. And the Uniform Crime Report comes out every year to tell us what crime in America looks like. The problem is it tells us what crime in America looked like in 2014. So right now we are almost halfway through 2016, and we don't have the picture for crime in America in 2015 yet. The latest data is 2014 data. But so let's take what we have, the 2014 data, and the 2014 data tells us that there were approximately 1,160 violent crimes in America in 2014. The problem is we also have a different measure called the National Crime Victimization Survey. And the National Crime Victimization Survey surveys the country and asks them, were you the victim of crime? And what crimes were you the victim of? According to the 2014 statistics on the National Crime Victimization Survey, there were 3 million victims of one or more crimes in America in 2014. This is a bit of a problem. More than a 100% problem, where we have people saying that they were victimized by crime and those who are actually reporting crime. So now, obviously, On the violent crime, of course, everybody reports violent crime, right? Well, according to, again, the National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS, only 61% of robberies were reported to the police, 58% of aggravated assaults, and 34% of sexual assaults, even reported to the police. So when we're talking about machine learning and artificial intelligence, we all know about garbage in, garbage out. The problem is the amount of bad information that we would have to feed into that machine to learn what? When we're not actually hitting anywhere near 99% of the crime that is happening in this country. The Uniform Crime Report also does hate crimes. Okay, this is the national count on hate crimes in this country. Again, I can't tell you the national count for 2015, but let's go to the national count for 2014. In 2014, California reported about 759 hate crimes. Let me ask the audience here. How many hate crimes did Alabama report? Throw out a guess.
0.
Little low, but not much.
5.
9. 9 hate crimes in Alabama. Let's go to Mississippi. The entire state of Mississippi. 759 in California, 9 in Alabama. How many in Mississippi? Little high. 1. But this is the data that we are supposed to input now into a machine to tell us how to stop hate crimes. Again, the UCR is the data that we are supposed to put into a machine to tell us how to address violent crime. And yet the data is so troublingly bad. Now, the other thing that we need to look at are our clearance rates, okay? Because obviously if we arrest someone, let's hope that we are arresting the right person who will then go to trial or take a plea and in fact be guilty of that crime. Well, our clearance rates for robbery, 28%. Okay, that is, someone was arrested for that crime, or the police were notified, the police were told of that crime, and someone was ultimately convicted of that crime. Violent crime in general, 47%. Homicide, a whopping 65%. Out of all homicides that we know about, in 65% of the cases is someone arrested for that crime. Okay, this isn't even talking about someone being convicted of that crime. This is someone arrested of that crime. So I come to you again with this enormous fear about what we're going to feed into a machine. Now, obviously, as human beings, we have not gotten this quite right. And the way we do criminal justice and civil rights right now is not quite right. But what happens when we feed this information into a machine? Look, many of you, I suspect, went to college. You were surrounded by some individuals who chose to use something illicit. Were the police there with the jump out boys? Were the police there doing undercover stings on your campus? You know the answer. And yet in many communities, that's what they face. And the statistics tell us that it's probably pretty close to the same number of people, black people, use drugs as white people. And yet if we look at the arrest statistics, far more black people are arrested for drug possession than are white people by percentage. So again, I'm all for artificial intelligence and machine learning, but I'm afraid that we're not ready for it yet in the criminal justice space until we really and truly clean up the data. And part of that is, I will tell you, is the work we're doing right now with something called the Police Data Initiative. Some of that is the work we're doing with Raid on the fact that we've been thinking that we knew why police officers did things that they shouldn't do, and basically what Raid is telling us is that we've been wrong all these years, that it really doesn't matter that, you know, someone is late to work a bunch of times, that what really matters, and there's some common sense to what Raid has been telling us, that is really about stress, but we have decades of research that we've built these early warning systems for police departments, which, by the way, we send through computers and we say, you know, Officer Smith needs an intervention, and it's been wrong. And the biggest and most important part of this isn't about, you know, which soap you use. This isn't about which car you drive. This is about liberty and the right for people to be free. And if we get this wrong and we continue to get this wrong, more people who should not be incarcerated will be incarcerated. And we should all have an enormous problem with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for your presentations, although I have to say I'm genetically an optimist, and you know, we started out with social ills and we ended up with stories about how poor some of the data is. So clearly we have a lot of challenges in front of us to really accomplish what we would like to. Maybe to just open up the discussion, I'd actually like to drill down on that a little bit, and Raid, maybe you could comment a bit on this. You know, to what extent do we actually have data that we can use in an actionable manner now versus really we have to take a longer term view and put processes in place that allow us over time to capture the data that we need to advance some of the problems we just heard?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a generic answer if it depends. But the level 2 answer is really what Roy was talking about, is in certain areas and in certain, so take criminal justice, right? If you have a department, if you have a jurisdiction that is doing the right thing and is doing well, they probably have better data than a department that's suppressing and take the complaint process. So we've been working in police departments, and take Chicago, where over the past 3 years, Chicago has had about 65,000 complaints about their officers, and I think a couple of hundred have been sustained. It's really hard to complain. You have to go somewhere and do this, then you have to sign an affidavit, then you have to identify the officer's name and ID. And so it's just, there are lots of barriers to accurate data. And so if you're a department that makes it hard, then you don't have enough data, and you shouldn't be using existing data. But there are exceptions. There are departments in our areas. So a lot of, in health and education and sustainability, for compliance reasons, they've been collecting data. So they've been collecting data on, you know, everything about students and everything about people's health habits. And in those cases where, because of regulations, data has just been collected as a logging system, we're in decent shape. Now, again, there are caveats there, where most schools have data on what happens to students, but they don't collect data on interventions that were just done implicitly. So you start predicting, oh, this kid is going to be fine. You don't know that they had 4 or 5 interventions. You think they're going to be fine, then you don't give them the intervention, and the kid suffers. So I think you have to be very careful about understanding the context of the data. You know, data was not sort of provided by somebody as this wonderful object that you should start using. But at the same time, if you don't start giving them benefits from this data, they're not going to collect more of it. They're not going to get better. So it has to be a little bit of both, where you start doing something which with making sure that it's not hurting people, and then use that to incentivize people to collect better data.
But just to follow up, so one of the dangers there then is you get a population bias. You gravitate toward where the data is good, and you find wonderful mechanisms where the data is good, but that still leaves a fairness or a bias issue where the data is not good.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say you would, you know, I think I'm looking at sort of take a jurisdiction, take a city, take a state, take a county that's doing well, as opposed to, you know, I mean, there are lots of issues with using 311 data. There's lots of issues using Twitter data. There's lots of issues using any sensor that's going to give you a bias. So instead of going after a bias sample of a population, go to a place where you can show, which is less biased, right? So again, certain cities are doing a better job of collecting data. Let's start with that. Now it's again, we're not going to be helping everyone, but we have to start by showing, I feel like we have to start by being cheerleaders to show what can be done, and then start getting people to sort of buy into the whole using data to do anything. Because right now, not many cities are using data to do anything.
A question from the audience or Twitter?
This is a multi-part question related to the garbage in, garbage out problem. As machine learning is integrated into our public services, how can we ensure that the systems are not discriminatory? And how do we avoid replicating the biases that have been in the system for so long?
So I'll start with that. And I was kind of intentionally pessimistic and a downer during my talk because I'm hot and tired. We're doing something about a lot of this. So we have something called the Police Data Initiative, and the Police Data Initiative is getting jurisdictions to start putting their data and making their data public. And we have about 56 jurisdictions doing this, covering more than 40 million people across the country. What those who have done it, like the Chief Brown from Dallas has said, is it gets me better data at the end of the day. Because when the population knows what is happening and can look at this data, it forces us to step up our game, and it creates a public check on the data. Louisville right now, if you check their open data portal, every single citation that is issued is listed almost in real time, disaggregated by race and gender. That is huge, because I now can say, I live on 100 Oak Street and I was just robbed, where is that showing up on this thing? I was just stopped for jaywalking, where is that showing up on this portal? And if it's not showing up, I have a chance to check it and correct it and to say that this is right. That's going to lead to better ability to go through and check the data. Now, the bias part is a whole nother question, because again, where law enforcement is where they're going to perform law enforcement duties. And where they perform law enforcement duties is, I hate to say it, is probably where they're going to find people breaking the law. And so we have to be very careful about saying that, because we call these places high crime areas. Look, sometimes, and when we're talking about homicide numbers, yes, okay, we can't get around that. When we're talking about drugs and drug use, we have to be really careful, because it's probably not only in that community where drugs are being sold and used. And so that is a bias we have to check. But it's a lot more training. It's a lot more really looking at and digging into this data. It's a lot more, and we've seen this from law enforcement personnel, really being courageous and saying, I'm going to put my data out there, and I'm going to let the population take a look at that and evaluate it and help us to figure out what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong.
Another question?
For Hannah, what are the best ways to combine predictive and explanative machine learning models?
Ooh, that is a great question. So, it's hard. That's my first answer. My second answer is, I spend a lot of time thinking about Bayesian latent variable models, and I do this specifically for a couple reasons. One of the advantages of working with these kinds of models is that you have these latent variables that can directly represent theoretical constructs in the real world. And so as a result, these models are very, very interpretable. But at the same time, you're learning this structure that actually helps you make good predictions. Yet when you make those predictions, you can dig back into the model and actually look at the values of those latent variables to really understand what's going on. The other thing that I think is really important in all this, and this is for the type of work that I do, I think this is something that really, really shouldn't be neglected, and that is the role of uncertainty. So I think when you're making any of these kinds of models, so be they models for prediction, models for explanation, models for measurement, you need to be able to represent and maintain uncertainty. You know, we're working with data that is noisy, that might not be very good. We don't want models that are making very, very confident predictions that we then go and trust when in fact maybe we shouldn't be so confident in those predictions. So I spend a lot of time working, again, with these Bayesian methods because they can actually represent, maintain, and help us reason under uncertainty. And I think that's a really important part of this picture.
And if I could just follow up, can you say just a little bit more, what are the challenges of representing uncertainty? I'm sure many people assume, well, there's statistics. Statistics, you know, represent errors in data and problem solved. So what are some of the key challenges there?
So I think there are two really big key challenges. The first one is one that I think computer scientists are very familiar with, and that's computational efficiency. So obviously, if you're maintaining a full distribution of uncertainty around some particular thing, it takes a lot to maintain that, to reason under it, to propagate it, and so on. And so these methods are, you know, computationally intensive. This is a real challenge, doing this in an efficient fashion with large quantities of data. The other problem, though, is the fact that humans are surprisingly bad at reasoning under uncertainty themselves. And so one of our biggest challenges is actually getting humans to understand what uncertainty means. You know, how is 99% certain about something different from, let's say, 65% certain about something, or even 25% certain? And then how should we actually use that uncertainty in making our decisions? And to me, that's kind of the more challenging problem. You know, we're going to get faster computers. That's great. I can sample things faster. That's lovely. I can do faster variational inference, whatever. But how am I going to get humans to understand uncertainty and actually think about it and take it into account? Yeah, that's tricky.
All right, thank you. Another question?
This question is for Raid. How do we build a stronger social/AI skill base with such a leaky STEM pipeline?
Somebody else want to take that one? I mean, I think historically, so one of the things we're noticing when we try to get students to work on these types of projects that are sort of data intensive but a very heavy social impact, we're finding we're getting a lot more than the traditional group coming through, right? So you're getting surprising, so this program that I run, Data Science for Social Good, we get about 900 applications a year for that program for about 40 spots. So, and it's about a 60-40 male-female distribution and so I don't think there is much of a leaky pipeline there. I think there is a pipeline, we just haven't been able to tap into it historically because we use computers to build games and you know, do things that are not really socially relevant. We're finding a lot of people who are interested in social aspects of computing. They're good at math and science, especially women in high school. They sort of see college students sitting by themselves on a computer building games, and they say, well, I'm going to study sociology or psychology and try to be, you know, and I think they're losing out on skills that are extremely useful for society, and so we're finding that that's actually this having it connected with social impact is helping that. Now, what we're still lacking is diversity in the kinds of people coming in and other socioeconomic status and possibly ethnicity. And it's, you know, it's not just a checkbox for this type of work. It's important to have that diversity because the kinds of problems we're solving, we need to have a group of people who belong to the same group to help solve that. We need to have empathy with those problems. And it can't be done if you have, you know, a very narrow set of people solving that. So I think it will take an extra effort, but we need to start talking more about like these types of events where AI is connected with something other than robots, drones, surveillance, and games. And I think this is a really great start at building that pipeline.
Excellent. I think on that note, we will end the panel. It's a wonderfully positive note to think about how we can educate the future.